I will do my technical spiel. I'll hand off to Lauren. Lauren will tee up the first set of opening polls to get people warmed up. And let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and admit the first round of people in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the USAID Asia Counter Trafficking in Persons Summit from Evidence to Action, hosted by Winrock International. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Assessing Vulnerability to Forced Labor and Human Trafficking, Recent Advances in Improving Measurement Validity. Today, we are using Zoom meetings to enable as much interactivity as possible. Your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many comments and questions as we can throughout today's session. To help us acknowledge you and your questions and inputs, please be sure to rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window, hovering over your name, clicking more, and then clicking rename. This meeting will be recorded, and please keep your camera off unless you are invited to speak in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. Continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags WinrockE2A and hashtag Evidence to Action. Once again, you are at the session titled Assessing Vulnerability to Forced Labor and Human Trafficking, Recent Advances in Improving Measurement Validity. All right, I believe we are now ready to get started. So I will go ahead and hand the floor to Lauren Dami, Deputy Director of the Chief Evaluation Office at the United States Department of Labor. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hermes. Morning and good evening to those of you joining us from different parts of the world, and good afternoon. One of our panelists is also in Europe. So welcome to our panel on measurement validity issues and studies of forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. And while people continue to join, please respond to our initial poll so we can get an idea of who's here. And we'll cycle through those results as I give some introduction to our panel topic. So again, I'm Lauren Dami, and today I'll provide some introduction to the material, and then we'll hear from 4 very distinguished speakers. We'll have a few more poll questions before each speaker to get you thinking about some of the topics that we'll be covering, so please be prepared to participate. And then at the end of the 4 short talks, we'll have a discussion and question and answer session. We can actually go until about 11:15. So a few housekeeping items. I think Hermes may have mentioned this, but everyone's muted, but if at the end we can have an interactive discussion, let's do so with people speaking. But in the meantime, please feel free to paste questions in the chat box at any time. And we'll mostly address those at the end, but panelists, obviously, if there's something that's brief to address during your talk, feel free to do so. So again, once again, for those just joining, I'm Lauren Dami. I'm the Deputy Director at the Chief Evaluation Office at the Department of Labor. The Chief Evaluation Office is an independent office responsible for coordinating, managing, and implementing the entire Department of Labor's evaluation program. And we also oversee a variety of other evidence-building activities on behalf of the department. This includes working with our international bureau, where I used to work in the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking, managing impact evaluations and surveys. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And we, meaning the Chief Evaluation Office, also run the department's clearinghouse that compiles all rigorous evaluations across a variety of labor-related topics. So I'm going to paste this into the chat now, one on child labor, because obviously this overlaps a lot with forced labor and human trafficking issues that we'll talk about today. So, but let's move on to why we're here. Our topic today is concerned with measurement validity issues that come up in different types of studies, using different methodologies that look at forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. But what exactly do we mean by measurement validity? So you can see these in the poll questions as well, but measurement validity refers to the question, are we accurately measuring what we really intend to measure? And we're essentially concerned with accuracy of measurement. Are we studying what we think that we're studying? And if not, how do we make informed decisions about study results if we're not studying what we think that we're studying? So especially anytime that we use a proxy variable for something that we want to capture or measure, we need to consider the degree to which our measure is valid. And we have to make judgments about the adequacy of our measures. And we typically try to validate them by testing them in a number of different ways, some of which the panelists will talk about today. So today's panelists are some of the world's leading researchers in their respective areas, and they're going to talk about the judgments that they have made in dealing with measurement validity, some challenges that they have faced, and share with you some practical thoughts and insights about what they've learned. So each panelist has worked on forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery, but each have very different methodologies that they will talk about today. And for the purposes of this panel, I'll let each panelist specify which constructs they've used related to forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery. But in essence, this panel is not about a deep dive on any one topic. Each panelist only has 10 minutes. The goal is more to give researchers, implementers, and policymakers a taste of recent advances in the field and the types of issues that need to be addressed in order to do really good and rigorous research. So we are going to start with examining individual level measurement of vulnerability with Dr. Sheldon Zhang. Then we're going to look at sector-based approaches with hopefully a sneak peek at supply chain modeling with Dr. Michael de Kock. And then we're going to move on to regional vulnerability models with Dr. Davina. And then we're going to have a look at an interdisciplinary approach to network modeling with Dr. Matthew Cameron-Kerwick. So before I introduce the first panelist a little bit more, let's look at these poll answers. It looks like people are either a researcher or a combination of the above, policymakers and practitioners, which is great. And it looks like most of you either think that there are problems with measurement validity or you're unsure about it, which is great because that's why we're here. And what aspects of measurement validity are challenging. It looks like our panelists have a lot of topics to cover, especially around data collection, which I know that Sheldon's going to talk about a bit. So now I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Sheldon Zhang, and we have some new poll questions that he'd like you to consider before his talk as well. And I'm going to paste his bio that he shared into the chat box as well. So I'm so happy that Sheldon, Dr. Zhang could join us today. He's a professor of criminology and justice studies, also the chair of the program at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He has decades of experience in the field of human trafficking. And even though he shared a very humble bio with me, I looked up to see some of his current statistics on himself, and he has 9 books, 64 academic journals, and many, many other publications under his belt. But the reason why I invited Sheldon to speak today, and the reason why I really like his work, is that he, as a principal investigator, really different studies from randomized control trials to ethnographic fieldwork, has paid really close attention to measurement validity issues during the design process. And today he's going to share some of his lessons learned over these many years of research quantifying trafficking and vulnerability measures using a recent experience in the Vietnam apparel sector, if I am not mistaken. Sheldon, what did you think of the poll results? I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for the nice introduction. Yes, I'm Sheldon Zhang with the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Yes, I've been doing this work quite a bit now. So I assume you can all see my screen nice, the PPT, right? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, and it looks like we can close down the poll, but people are thinking about pilot testing is something where researchers should validate measurement instruments, and people mostly think that you should collect experiences and then researchers determine whether or not anyone meets the criteria of trafficking victimization.
Great. Wonderful. It's a great start. Okay. Good morning and good evening, good afternoon, everywhere you are. I am Sheldon Zhang, and I've been asked to give a talk on measurement validity in human trafficking research. By the way, I'll be using modern slavery and human trafficking interchangeably here. Years ago, when I was talking to Michaela, we were struggling on which terminology we should agree on using in our conversation because there are so many overlaps here. I've spent the last 2 decades struggling to figure out ways to measure modern slavery. And now I'm given 10 minutes to sum it up. So let's get right to it. All right, so here's a little quiz things that you should know had you paid attention in your grad school research methods class. Those of you who were trained in sociology, psychology, or other related fields know that these are fairly standard procedures in validating measurement. Although there are multiple ways one can assess or improve measurement validity in social research, surprisingly, the range of options for validating measurements in human trafficking research has remained rather limited. Frankly, our discourse on measurement validity thus far has mostly been about construct validity. That is, most of us are still struggling to find common ways to define and operationalize the concept of human trafficking slash modern slavery slash forced labor slash so on and so forth into specific measures. Sorry, my lawn worker is out of the window, so you would hear humming sounds quite a bit. My apologies. Okay, so it is a messy business, starting with the many terminologies being thrown around to describe a range of similar human experiences. All of us are familiar with the legal frameworks, the UN Protocol, TVPA, and the ILO Convention on Forced Labor. I'm not telling you anything new here, but we are collectively still struggling to translate these legal frameworks into survey questions that people, oftentimes poorly educated and definitely underprivileged, can understand and answer. How we count victims of modern slavery or human trafficking bears significant consequences on how we estimate prevalence or establish baseline. I can tell you that on many occasions, researchers adjust their threshold in order to make the uncovered rate of human trafficking appear reasonable. There's no agreement on what specific items ought to be included in our measurement of modern slavery. Those of us in the field have largely been doing our own translation or operationalization of these legal frameworks. Now, at the heart of the measurement validity problem are three separate but related dilemmas. First, who gets to decide if a situation qualifies for modern slavery? So far, there have largely been two approaches. One relies on the victim's self-diagnosis, best represented by the Walk Free Foundation's surveys around the world, where researchers depend on if the respondents consider themselves victims of forced labor. Another approach relies on professional opinions, which reflects mostly a Western clinical social work perspective, where the professionals measure and assess the symptoms or take measurements of key indicators and then render a professional opinion on a situation. Think DSM-5. You will understand what I mean. I'm not advocating one approach over the other because each method has its own methodological appeals. Let me assume that we have solved the first dilemma. We've decided which one ought to be the one who decide whether a situation is trafficking or forced labor. Now let's assume this dilemma is solved. Now here comes the second one. What is the threshold or the tipping point over which we call a situation modern slavery? We have not been able to establish a commonly accepted threshold or the equivalent of 270 electoral votes beyond which a situation is considered modern slavery. In other words, we are struggling with construct validity issues. Now, related to this threshold question is the third dilemma. Is modern slavery a concept of additive or cumulative events or a general state of existence? Modern slavery or human trafficking is often portrayed as a crime, which suggests a criminal justice framework. If so, then crime is traditionally studied as an incident or event, a rather binary perspective. It either happened or not. We know modern slavery or human trafficking cannot be easily defined in terms of singular events. Now, if this incident-oriented perspective doesn't work, then how about conceptualizing modern slavery as a state of existence then we're talking about a temporal framework, a month, a year, or some other time denominations. You see, things can get very messy very quickly. Fortunately, so far, I've seen very few instruments out there that include measures on temporal duration. Most of us have opted for counting events or incidents. These are not only conceptual, but also practical problems that need solutions because they affect how we report prevalence and how we establish a baseline to assess program impact. Therefore, we need to work through these dilemmas and reach conceptual clarity on how to operationalize the construct of modern slavery. Now, once beyond the desk work, by the way, all the previous slides were talking about people can sit down, talk to your peers, and go to conferences and reconcile or debate through these construct validity issues. Now, beyond the desk work, there are practical strategies that we can employ to improve our measurement validities. These include peer reviews, as we discussed earlier, cognitive tests, focus groups, and pilot tests. Now, these exercises are important because as field researchers, we want to pre-test the wording, flow, and the structure of a survey instrument, and also rehearse our field procedures. We want to know if prospective respondents understand the questions. Are there different interpretations to the same questions? Any potential bias towards social desirability, demand characteristics, or whether there's adequate clarity in timeframes, or are the items conducive to accurate memory retrieval? What I rarely see in our quest for measurement validity, the second section of our slide, is ex post analysis on data collected from the field to assess the convergent or discriminant properties of an instrument. I've not seen much literature on any ex post analysis of measurement in human trafficking research. This is important because we're measuring various ranges of similar human experiences. In other words, we expect measures positively reflective of modern slavery to cluster or converge and exhibit different or discriminant response patterns to those that are not related to human trafficking or modern slavery. Now, finally, what I want to introduce is this niche tool called item response theory. I've tried it a couple of times before and published on it. It's a very nice tool that I suggest if you have the time and resources, and definitely should try it. This is a measurement development strategy that seeks to explain the relationship between unobserved characteristics or attribute and their observed outcomes and responses. Our IRT models can establish a link between the properties of the items on the instrument, individuals responding to these items, and the underlying trait being measured. IRT models can improve scales and measures by including items with high discrimination that add to the precision of the measurement tool, and most importantly, lessen the burden of answering long questionnaires, which is a common problem now in many of our trafficking surveys. Okay, so where we are now at this point in terms of our measurement. Here's the current state of a measurement in our field. One branch is really on the continuation of ILO's seminal work, hard to see and harder to count. You will hear Michael's talk later, back in 2012. And with a focus on measuring 4 aspects of the labor processes: the recruitment phase, whether it's free, and the work and life under duress, and the possibility or impossibility of leaving an employer, and of course, the penalty or menace of penalty. Over the years, my team has been focusing on the last 2 components of the ILO approach: the impossibility to leave and a penalty. We've developed a 2-step approach. First, we'll look at any experiences of abuse or rights violations in the course of providing human labor, sexual or otherwise. Second, we'll examine if respondents feel trapped or unable to exit because of the severe consequences, that is, exit penalty. This 2-step approach has 2 clear advantages: conceptual clarity, and more importantly, pragmatic application. This two-step approach can avoid the simplicity of incident-based measures and bypass the messy businesses of quantifying the duration and repeated exposure to victimization. We argue that the hallmark of modern slavery or human trafficking is less about how one finds himself or herself in an abusive or an unpleasant work environment, but more importantly, about the ability, whether he or she can leave or exit a situation without significant penalty. To put simply, freedom to quit without fears of retribution should be the key measure that defines the nature of a work situation. Finally, much effort has been made in harmonizing measurements on modern slavery. For instance, in this last round of PAM's funding, 6 teams of researchers from different universities and research organizations are funded to conduct prevalence estimations in 7 countries. All teams are asked to comply with a uniform set of indicators. And let me show you the example. Those of you who are tracking ILO's works will find this chart quite familiar. Such funding agency initiated operational guidelines can quickly and importantly compel researchers to agree on what is or is not modern slavery. Suffice it to say, we've come a long way in establishing common protocols in measuring modern slavery. While not perfect, these guidelines help move the field along so we can begin to communicate in a common language and stick to a common standard in the measurement of a prevalence and baseline. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheldon. I am definitely planning to read a few more of your papers on item response theory. I don't know if you have any links you could put into the chat box for people, but that would be quite useful. And participants, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we can address them at the end. So in the meantime, we have some new poll questions for you while I introduce our next panelist. Hopefully they will pop up in a second. So please feel free to answer those. So our next panelist is Dr. Michaël de Kock, the ILO. I have known Michaël for many years, and I'm so honored that she agreed to join us today. She is the head of the Research of Evaluation Unit in the International Labor Organization's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch. And she has been one of the main brains behind and just completely instrumental in leading the years of groundwork that have gone into the ILO's global estimates of forced labor, and more recently, the ILO's collaboration with Walk Free on global estimates of modern slavery. So this groundwork has meant developing, piloting, and testing various sampling methods and instruments for forced labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery in countries around the world. And she has seen it all. Also, I can say that I've never met a nicer mathematician. I don't know if you know that you have that award in my head, Michaël. It's true. So today she's going to share with us some of her lessons learned in developing sector-based estimates of the prevalence of forced labor. And she'll talk a little bit about data challenges and sources. And maybe if we're lucky, we will get a preview of the ILO's new work estimating forced labor and global supply chain. So it looks like in terms of the polls, people are thinking about constructs more as a series of related incidents, but it looks like maybe a number of them would be useful in many people's eyes. And for the second question, to effectively take action to combat exploitation, it sounds like people really think it depends on who's taking the action about what would be most important to measure, the way that we should tackle measurement. So with that, Michaël, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have a chance to share our work. I'm a bit like Sheldon, you know, having worked for quite a long time on this field. And I decided, or we decided when we were preparing, that we will go out of our zone of comfort. I'm not talking about what we are doing on a daily basis and we think we know how to do it, but rather to move on the current challenges. What's coming now? What are the new requests and the new challenges? And that's why we go from the household survey to the work in supply chain. So just one slide on, let's say, our comfort zone. As you know, we've moved in the last 20 years from some experimental survey, pilot surveys, to, in 2018, the adoption by all member states of what we call a resolution, a statistical standard on how to measure forced labor. So this is really a huge achievement that thanks to all of you, all of us who have been piloting, making mistakes, improving, we were managed as an expert group to come to this body, which is an international body of labor statisticians, and present guidelines, submit guidelines on how to measure forced labor, and they were approved by all member states. So this is our new, let's say, framework, statistical framework. And I invite all of you, if you have to design survey, to refer. So it's quite easy. You type ILO, ICLS, like International Conference of Labor Statisticians, forced labor, and you will find them. And this, Sheldon, I was really happy to hear your comment about, is it an event or an incident or state? To a certain extent, the ICLS gives ILO answer to that by saying in order to measure forced labor, you need 4 elements. It has to be work. And work is not that easy to define. And there is a full statistical definition of work. That's for forced labor. I don't want to insist. But the second element is a reference period. You know, forced labor doesn't happen in the outside the working life of people. And in order, whenever you measure forced labor, we need to have a clear reference period. Are we measuring instant forced labor? The person is in forced labor at the time of the survey, or has been in forced labor in the last 2 years, 3 years. So there is a whole discussion on that issue, which has a very strong impact on the estimate. And those who did follow the discussion around the global estimate with WOC3 and IOM, we made really a point on how to move from what we call a flow, the total number who have been in forced labor in the last 3 years, to a stock. How many on average are in forced labor for 1 day? So that's really related to the duration, or how long people are in forced labor, which is critical for policymaker. And because your session is on evidence to action, you know, it's not the same if we know that people are in forced labor for 1 week, 1 day, 1 week, or 3 years. So that's a key element to measure how long people are in that situation. To come back to the work and let's say what we are doing now, really it's amazing that we had to wait for 10 years or 15 years of pilot to do the first cognitive testing in a variety of languages. That's something that we are doing now systematically in English, French, Spanish for the time being. We plan to do it in local languages soon, and we've learned a lot from that. And again, that's a point which is also common with Sheldon presentation. And second point I wanted to make on this zone of comfort is how much we have improved our sampling techniques for classical survey, like household surveys, labor force surveys, or surveys for one specific group. You will find quite a lot of literature on that, and all of you know that we can have fantastic questionnaire. If the sampling is wrong, the results are crap. So that's something we have learned, and how to improve our sampling for forced labor, which is a rare event. But now I would like to move to what's the new challenge. In the last years, we've seen more and more requests for prevalence estimate of forced labor in a given sector. Basically, the question came to us as, can you help us to know if there is child labor or forced labor or trafficking in the cotton production of my country, or cocoa, or palm oil, coffee, mica, whatever. One sector, and there is a need to know if it's clean or not. And these requests come both from government and business, as you can imagine. So what are the challenges? First, in all those sectors, all over the world, you have a mix of formal and informal sector. That has a huge implication for our research because the sampling frame will never be complete. That means in the best case, you go to a country, whether it's any of these products, you will have a list of establishments, which will be the formal, the registered farms or mines or companies. But all the cotton which is produced at home or the coffee which is produced around my farm with my children is not part of the sampling frame. So in order to design good sampling, we are facing a huge difficulty, which was not the case in the first 20 years of household survey. Second is all these ethical issues and access to workers at risk of forced labor, which is much more critical when you survey, sectoral survey than household. We can assume that people are safe in their household, that you can have an interview in safe place without anyone listening. When you move to sectoral survey, and if you move to establishment survey, you always put your workers more at risk and eventually the interviewers as well. A third component of challenges is not only you have formal and informal sector or establishment, but also in many sectors where people are paid piece rate, you have one official worker, even in informal sector. Let's say there is a kind of oral contract between the employer and a person, an adult, but in fact, the work is brought home, or the worker will bring the family to help in the piece rate work. That means if we assume that if we find this worker in forced labor, it's likely that the whole family who is helping is also in forced labor. So that's a real issue for those sectoral surveys. All of you who have done work in the brick kiln, for example, will know what I'm talking about, where people are paid by piece rates. You will say, okay, this man is working. And when you go, you will see 3 children and a wife with the man doing the brick work. And last is also that even if you find ways, and I'm thinking of a cotton production where we thought we could go to the place where the cotton is sold, actually very quickly there is a mix in those places of the production coming from various types of establishment being formal, informal, and it's not easy to track. So the way we approached those challenges are the following. First, before doing any quantitative survey, we take the time necessary for qualitative research to understand the organization of the sector. How is the palm oil produced in my country? Is it big farms, small farms, family-based? How is it, where is it sold? How can I find the establishment? So very important to have a very good understanding of the sector in the country. So that has to be replicated for each survey. Even if you do a good survey in coffee production in one country, if you are to do it in another country, this qualitative assessment has to be redone because it's really specific to each place. Same for the qualitative assessment of the forms of forced labor. In this sector, in this country, who are the people at risk? Are they migrant workers? Are they legal, mainly legal or illegal migrants? Who are they family as a whole? So that the survey instruments will be targeted to these groups at risk. Third, importance of doing a very solid risk assessment for the workers in forced labor. And if it's not possible to implement the survey, ensuring the safety of those people at risk, then stop and no survey. Four, we have designed now and piloted in a few countries a new sample strategy to address especially the issue of this formal and informal establishment producing the same product in the same country, and with no possibility to have complete listing frame. So that was presented in an expert workshop last year to some of you. Basically, we move from the list of establishments which are known to the PSU, the list of households from the country, assuming that there is proximity between the household where the workers live and the establishment that produce the product to be surveyed. The questionnaire are not fully the same as for household survey. When you do an establishment survey or a survey for a sector, we have some questions which are really specific to this crop or to this mining sector or to this product, which is the topic. Just one word on COVID contingencies. As all of you, we had to stop our survey or to modify, to move to telephone survey in the best case. And that really, it's a new challenge that we face. And just to finish, although the previous challenge is not fully met, we are moving one step forward, which is moving to sectoral approach to a full supply chain. So the question now is not, is there forced labor in the cotton production, but is there forced labor in my garment production? That means I should look at cotton production, but also the mills, no, not the mills, the spinning, where you do spinning, the thread, up to the garment factory. So if you want to answer that question about forced labor in a given supply chain, it's because we need estimates on variables of interest by branch of economic of the supply chain, which can be several. It can be agriculture, in industry, you can have a full range of branch of economic activities, but also an estimate for the supply chain as a whole. And the objective is to measure forced labor indicators over the supply chain, but also to have the analysis of the relationship between tiers. So as you can imagine, that really raises new challenges. One is, how do you sample a supply chain without doing a full mapping? It's almost impossible to do a full mapping of one huge supply chain. We did a pilot, our colleagues in the ILO did a pilot, full mapping. It's a huge work and very costly to do in normal circumstances. And then, how do you sample establishment at each tier? Assuming that you have clarity on the whole supply chain, how do you sample and how do you move from one tier to another one? So the tools we are working on and that we will publish next year, and by the way, there will be hard to see, harder to count version 2 next year, where we will share the lessons learned from the last 10 years. And along with hard to see, there will be these new tools. First is new sampling tools to build to sample the supply chain, and those sampling tools build on the links between establishment and branches of economic activity over the full supply chain. This is based on a paper from our colleague Farhad Mehran. It's not yet published. We shared it. It's quite innovative. It's really using techniques to avoid the full mapping, which we know it's too expensive. The second type of tool that we are developing is establishment questionnaire, because in such a survey, if you want to estimate forced labor along a full supply chain, we need to interview the managers, the establishment, of course, to capture the characteristic of the supply chain, but also the relationship. Basically, if you go to an establishment, you need either to know to whom they sell their products or to whom they buy their products, whether you go downwards or upward the supply chain. And this also not only helps to support some, but also to reconstruct the input-output framework. And last series of tools are workers' questionnaire. They are very close to the normal forced labor questionnaire, based on the 4 elements that I did mention. Is the person working? What is the reference period? Is there an element of involuntary work and the menace of a penalty?
Mikhail, I don't know if there's anything we could say for we're a little over. Is there anything else that we could share during the Q&A discussion?
What do you? I'm done. Huh? It's done. What do you mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you had other slides.
No. It's done.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. This is so much food for thought. And as always, I feel like the ILO always has a lot of really cool tools under development for us to look forward to, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A on both sectors and supply chains, because I think that it's sort of a new area for me personally also that I'm interested in hearing more about. But thank you so much. So we have some new Mentee poll questions for you to check out while I introduce our next panelists. So Dr. Davina Durgana, our next panelist, is a little bit tough to introduce because she's an extremely impressive person. You can check out her bio in the chat box. I'll paste it now. Let me just.
Well, one thing I'm not, Lauren, is the nicest statistician you know. I'm honored to lose that title to Mikhail.
So, Davina's current primary affiliations are as affiliated faculty at National Defense University and visiting faculty at Oxford University's Green Templeton College. And she's won numerous awards for her statistical contributions to the study of modern slavery. And she's also co-author of the Walk Free's Global Slavery Index. And it's her work as a senior statistician with Walk Free that we're focusing on today. And so I asked her to be a part of the session, not for the Global Slavery Index itself necessarily, but because Walk Free has undergone this really interesting multi-year process to develop and validate their vulnerability models, which are somewhat lesser known component of the Global Slavery Index. And they may be buried in an index of the main report. So is going to talk a bit about how she's dealt with some of the theoretical and database challenges to developing regional vulnerability models today. So Davina, it looks like some of the poll results are in. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. That was a great introduction. And I'm honestly so honored to be on this panel today because like Mikhail said, we're very used to presenting on some of the things you may have heard from us before about our traditional areas of work. And this is actually a really exciting area of development that I'm just looking forward to sharing with you all. Thanks, Lauren. The poll looks really interesting. So it looks like many of you are a little bit about the models that are used to predict prevalence or vulnerability, but you'd like to know more, which is excellent for the next 10 minutes. And of course, the whole panel. And I'm really grateful to see that there's an appreciation for theory in model development, because fundamentally that's one of the things that we'll talk about today. And of course, data source availability and quality and testing. So many of you may know me from the Global Slavery Index work, but as Lauren said, one of the really exciting pieces of our national prevalence estimation efforts is what we do when we don't have direct primary data, when we don't have a national survey or a multiple systems estimate or anything that can give us context for what's going on in a specific modeling. So for today, for the next 10 minutes, and I'll try to stick to time on that, Lauren. Basically, we're going to talk about how we've evolved in our thinking from global to regional risk models and why that's important. I'll talk about how I went through model construction at the regional levels and some of the things that might inform some of your thinking as you're looking at how to do this as well. And actually, I'm really excited to share some of the developments we have specifically in Asia Pacific. I'm helping to manage this project on slavery at sea that we're undertaking with our colleagues within the Minderoo Foundation at Flourishing Oceans. So there's quite a bit of excitement there. We'll also be focusing on the garment industry. So really excited to see some of the thinking that, of course, we really appreciate from Sheldon on the apparel industry and specifically in Vietnam. And then we'll talk a little bit also about forced and child marriage. Garments and forced and child marriage will also be areas of focus for us this year. And then, of course, just as always, an invitation to collaborate, to reach out with any questions you might have. So when we're talking about this evolution from our global model, this might look familiar. As Lauren says, it is, believe it or not, buried in the Global Slavery Index. And this is one of the things we use to try to determine how we apportion some of our prevalence estimates and how we determine similar risk profiles near countries. But as you can imagine, this is an area that is really full of assumptions. And at a global level, and so for years, we've been thinking of ways to make this vulnerability modeling a bit more specific and a bit more sensitive to variations across regions. Of course, with our collaboration with the ILO, this became even more exciting because now we're thinking about regional estimates and how we can make the most use out of those as well. So we're very optimistic that this can be just another tool in our arsenal effectively. You all know that our goal, as we've mentioned, is to look at not just the regional totals for the Global Slavery Index, that's our joint work with the ILO, but then we look at a little bit more specificity within countries. And so basically, this is how we've done it. Now, some of this is going to seem a little, one of the things that was really critical, and again, I'm so thrilled to see many of you interested in the theoretical development, is that with vulnerability modeling, we are trying to account for a lot of information that we don't otherwise have. So for me, having a consistent basis in a theoretical model that's consistent and logical is really important because we want some consistency across how we're thinking about these constructs. We traditionally have used situational crime prevention theory that focuses on the absence of a capable guardian, a willing offender, and a vulnerable target for the commission of a crime like modern slavery. And we've also used human security theory, which is embedded in the UN Development Program framework, and effectively looks at 7 areas of insecurity: environmental insecurity, political insecurity, economic insecurity, community and personal insecurity, food insecurity, and health insecurity. Now, the reason why those areas of insecurity really are valuable to me is because it's when we're constructing a vulnerability index, some of these areas of data are very difficult to quantify. Environmental insecurity is a very difficult thing to quantify at a global level. And even when you do find some of that data, it often falls out of your model. And so for me, the integration of both the situational crime prevention theory that looks at layers and levels of vulnerability, but then also these areas of human insecurity are really helpful because they ensure that we're thinking of vulnerability in the broadest possible way and forcing ourselves to find potential data sources that can respond to all of these areas that we can assess. This is also an area of our work that has to be informed by expert knowledge and the literature. Really, this is where we're going to find a lot of valuable information about trends and vulnerability factors that we may not otherwise be considering. Specifically, when we're talking about Asia Pacific, some of the things that we're looking at in particular within environmental insecurity looks at the effects of climate change that can be climate refugees. It can be the effects of a lot of the negative externalities related to modern slavery industries. We look at economic insecurity, and specifically we focus on low wage and high risk industries. It's really interesting when we talk about personal, community, and security, because of course this is an element of construct development that has been really challenging. When we weren't able to define a theoretical threshold beyond which something moved from community to personal insecurity or vice versa, we actually made the decision to combine those two factors. And it was a really interesting methodological decision, because without a theoretical or a clear construct of our model that would say that this is how an independent person would make similar decisions, we were worried that there was too much bias in how we would interpret this. So it's a fascinating thing, because when we look at personal, community, and security, we are effectively looking at harmful cultural traditions as patriarchal dominance at individual and then at collective levels. And that's a particular relevance in the Asia Pacific region. We look at political insecurity, and specifically migration and governance as a huge trend, particularly recently. And we look at health insecurity as access to healthcare, and that's taken on a completely new dimension with COVID, as you can imagine. And then health insecurity, we look at hunger and malnutrition. So in a nutshell, this is effectively the ecosystem within which we would like to operate with these regional vulnerability models. But this is almost the easier part. This is the theory, this is the framework, but then how do we actualize it? This is what I've learned. These are my best practices, and I think that they are definitely going to probably help as others think about this. So please reach out to me if anyone's brainstorming how to develop their own models, because there's a lot of discussion and thought that can go either way on these. We talked about theory quite a bit. Data reduction is also a huge issue. So when we're talking about several areas of vulnerability data, what you're also going to end up with is an unwieldy model when you have hundreds of potential variables to include. So data reduction prior to empirical assessment really means that you're now thinking about conceptual ways of grouping some of these variables together. I mentioned why comprehensive vulnerability variable selection initially is really important. And then that's again why I've operationalized the human security theory. And then again, we have to remember that we want parsimonious models. So in the way that we have generally a lot of data sparsity that we deal with at this level, we worry about the policy implications and a lot of the assumptions that go into these models. Of course, we can try to do a lot of really fancy and exciting analyses, but generally, I found that a lot of the parsimonious or the simplest models are very compelling. I've also struggled a lot, especially in the vulnerability modeling process, with data imputation. Of course, that's not ideal. And but we do have these data sparsity issues. We have these gaps that must be addressed. The regional vulnerability modeling has enhanced and improved our efforts there a little bit, because at least we have an environment where we can have data that's specific to a region. So there may be variables that are not sufficiently enumerated across all regions, but it may be something that's relevant specifically in Africa or specifically in Asia. So that has been really interesting. The other component of data imputation that has been really exciting is thinking about how we can meld both our data gaps with the data reduction that we undertake in the beginning. So there's always a process of looking at correlation matrices and making sure that our variables are not redundant within our models. But then instead of just completely disregarding the fact that those redundant variables were removed, we can also consider using them for a form of data imputation, especially if we're looking at a factor that is already theoretically and conceptually aligned, such as political insecurity. You may have tested 10 variables for political insecurity and only retained 1 or 2 in your final model. But if you have missing data gaps within that, countries, for example, that just don't have any kind of data points for political insecurity, that's an opportunity to look at some of the redundant variables that were not included in your final model and to think about perhaps using averaged values or other components from those similar variables as data imputation points. So just a component that we can think a little bit more creatively about what we're doing with this broad base of data that we're collecting in the first place. And then of course, it's really tempting when we're developing vulnerability models, especially to test them, to assess what is the impact on prevalence. And of course, that's something that we're very excited about just exploring more, but also to remember that a lot of these tools will have some challenges in terms of circular logic. Sometimes we may have used some of these data sources to compile other like prior prevalence estimates. And so just being very careful about independence in how we do this. And on that point, the global vulnerability model will not ever incorporate the same variables and the same data points exactly that the regional ones will. So we'll have two distinct forms of vulnerability modeling, which should be really compelling in that regard. At the end of the day, our Asia Pacific model, and this is kind of like a sneak peek, this is where we've ended up, you can see that these are still proxies, right? We have to remember that all of our vulnerability variables are still approximations of the broader phenomenon. So it's really important to take them as a collective whole, that we're thinking about political insecurity not just as one measure. It's not just the presence of refugees and internally displaced persons. It has to be a collectivity of all of these things that approximate something similar to what we're looking at. And so I expect that every region will have, of course, different vulnerability factors that go into the model in the first place, but then also different groupings between what's retained and what actually would be the most useful conceptually as well. And then I'm just going to touch on this really quickly. I hope you can see this. It's a bit big, but this is, again, another sneak peek at the more specific elements of what's gone into each of these draft models in the Asia Pacific. But just to note, so the Slavery at Sea project, we are looking very carefully at how to validate existing models by Global Fishing Watch that are going to help us assess the likelihood of vessels at sea to be undertaking, to be complicit in forced labor. So the way that we're doing that is based on an exhaustive search right now of all the cases we can identify and the characteristics of the vessels involved. And our aim is to create predictive models based on that. There are large collective groups that are now thinking about how we develop frameworks around that. Conservation International is leading one of those. And we're also really excited to be participating in the primary data collection on this. Of course, as all of my colleagues can attest to, COVID has certainly presented some unique challenges in terms of accessing a lot of the populations of interest, particularly with slavery at sea and how often ships are coming to port, but we are resolutely working to resolve that. And with that, I'll just also, again, reiterate that these are the garment and the forced and child marriage are always areas of interest for us. So we are open to any comments and collaboration. So I think that's just about time, if not a little bit over, Lauren.
All right, thank you, Davina. And I hope that some of our attendees get in touch to learn more and maybe collaborate on some of the work that you're inviting them to do so on. So that's very exciting. So I think we have a couple more poll questions to go up while I introduce our last panelist. And I wanted to share with everyone that we are going until 11:15 for this panel. So we should have a little bit of time for Q&A after Matt's presentation. So over the past 9 years or so, while I was working on child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking issues, one of the things that I've noticed, and I know a lot of people in this group and others have probably noticed, is that our field primarily draws and almost exclusively draws from the social sciences. So economics, sociology, anthropology, statistics, obviously. But for that reason, when I learned about the National Science Foundation's efforts to sort of broaden this multidisciplinary approach to addressing illicit networks, including sex and labor trafficking networks, I was super excited to partner with them to bring new tools to bear on our problems around exploitation. So with that, I wanted to introduce Dr. Matt Kammer-Kerwick. He's a senior research scientist at the IC Squared Institute in Texas. And he's an engineer by training and one of the original researchers funded by this effort to bring together computer scientists, operations engineers, and social scientists to better understand how to map, predict, and interdict trafficking networks, and also look more broadly at how these trafficking networks overlap with other illicit networks like drug trafficking and other types of corruption. So he has been doing some really fascinating work as the principal investigator of the NSF-funded study, Disrupting Exploitation and Trafficking in Labor Supply Networks. I'll let him talk a little bit more about that, but he is bringing to bear these stochastic multi-actor network models, learning algorithms, and agent-based models, which are a big focus in this area to assess and develop disruptive interventions for labor exploitation and trafficking. So he has some new perspectives to share with us today, some interesting questions and challenges to pose for our research community. So Matt, it looks like we have some responses to the poll. It looks like some people are direct service providers, and a lot of people have worked with survivors or victims in this group, but fewer with perpetrators, which I know is interesting to you.
Yes, it's super interesting, and you can see my slides. Maybe Lauren, you can nod and you can hear me.
Yep.
All good.
Yep.
Excellent. So yes, it looks like we have a lot of experience with survivors and some experience with perpetrators. And as I go through this presentation, I will be mindful of the fact that we have 15 minutes left for our session, so I'll try to move through efficiently. I have a few slides that I'll skip past out of the interest of time. I do have an engineering background, but to Lauren's point, the funding from NSF is interdisciplinary. The disruption of illicit supply networks as a research thrust is funded from engineering, and that's where the funding started. But as I continue to work on these social problems, I'm becoming a quantitative social scientist, certainly. In fact, the most recent funding we have is from the Social and Economic Science Division of the Directorate of Law and Science. So I'm not even getting funding from the engineering directorate anymore. And I also had the great privilege of talking with Sheldon Zhang early in my efforts in human trafficking to get an understanding of some of the issues. Mikhail and I have just met today. Davina I know for several years as well. And you'll see that I'm more of a practitioner when it comes to this panel than the other panelists. I feel like coming at the end as a way to kind of tap into some of the things that they've talked about, partly because they've taught me those things over the years. Before I move off this front slide, I will mention that in addition to being housed at the Bureau of Business Research with that engineering background, a lot of this work, virtually all of this work, has been done in collaboration with the School of Social Work at the University of Texas. And so that's another part of my transition from business analytics and engineering to more social science perspective on things. And what I'm going to do in this talk is give you a little bit of interdisciplinary background from how I've also done work with the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault with other measures of vulnerability and how that's kind of shaped our thinking about how we measure vulnerability and then what we do after we establish vulnerability and the need to continue to try to measure perpetration, which I'm happy to see the other panelists talk about relative to supply chain and establishment questionnaires as well as worker questionnaires in particular. So I know we have lots of questions, but I sat down and wrote some questions that would motivate the little bit of talk that I'm going to give here. And then I'll use these questions to select from a few slides that come next and skip a few. So don't worry if I skip past them, I'm just choosing to select some items based on time. And some of these issues will resonate with things that the other panelists have talked about. How broadly should we measure behaviors, in particular in this interdisciplinary lens? I look at sexual assault as a broad range of behaviors that doesn't center on, but certainly is broader than rape as an example in sexual violence. Exploitation among laborers compared to the technical definitions, the legal definitions that Sheldon was talking about for labor trafficking, whether we have the specific merits of force, fraud, and coercion, that brings us into a legal realm, but then there's plenty of opportunity to look at vulnerability for various types of exploitation surrounding that. And then the patterns of vulnerability that we measure versus the decision-making about the context of that vulnerability. That's an issue that Sheldon brought up in his talk in terms of whether we should look at this as a state of being, something that individuals move into and out of based on their interactions with others in the ecosystem. And then the bottom line here is this broad intersectionality, the Venn diagram of how trafficking overlays with sexual violence and family violence, for example. Much of sex trafficking can be attributed to starting with a relationship. Much of labor trafficking can be attributed to starting with a job offer. Most of the time in both of those contexts, the person who's being victimized or exploited knows or is familiar with the person who is doing the exploitation. And again, resonating with previous themes, these episodic experiences, repeated cycles of victimization between victims and perpetrators, and the need for us to continue to study these behaviors over time, not just snapshots, surveys that we're doing to establish point in time victimization, not just retrospective recall of victimization patterns that have occurred in the past, but also looking at trajectories of behavior and establishing the lived experience over time. And their interactions with other participants. We have the supply chain view where you have workers and employers, but you have other actors participating in those supply chains who are either able to witness and intervene or stand back and observe without participating. These are all kinds of things that we draw on from, in my experience, from these other areas of violence and social injustice that provide relevant lessons to us. I don't think I'll get into much of the sampling concerns that I list here at the bottom, but I do want to make sure we as a panel talk about not just COVID as it impacts our research, but trafficking is often discussed as a public health crisis. So it'd be a good way for us to end this session, in my opinion, if we were to try to discuss what we could learn from both society's attitude and society's response to COVID relative to public health interventions, awareness issues, social change regarding those. So this is a reading slide. I hope to be able to share these slides with you, but the slides that follow will draw on this literature. I won't show that for more than just this second, but across that literature, these are all methods that we've used in our applied research. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, sexual violence and misconduct. We have used the sexual experiences questionnaire for sexual harassment, the sexual experiences survey for sexual violence. Those areas of study and areas of practice go back, at least in terms of formal measurement, a little bit longer than the trafficking and exploitation work. 1995 for the SEQ, 1982 for the SES, and those provide, at least for me, some framework for how our field might evolve over the next 10 years or so. We had some interesting developments discussed by the other panelists as they're creating new measures, improved measures for assessing vulnerability and victimization. I have on the right side some measures that we've used in our projects, both in Texas and more broadly, a measurement from the Covenant House, Meredith Dank's measurement, the human trafficking, the human trafficking survey tool, primarily for sex trafficking and runaway and homeless youth, the TVIT, and of course, Sheldon Zhang's great work in labor exploitation and trafficking, which I've drawn on heavily in our work. Although the sexual violence and misconduct measurement tools have decades longer use and refinement and revision in the field, the same thing is going on in the human trafficking and exploitation field, some of which was reported on by our fellow panelists. But we generally are working with behaviorally specific questions. Often those behaviors are broken down into subscales, more refined components of behavior, often including perpetration tactics, so that we get an understanding of the context within which these behaviors occur. And generally, and we can see this in our audience here today, they're often used to measure victimization, but at times perpetration. And part of the work that I'm engaged with the NSF funding now is to try to look at the connection and the interaction between victims and survivors and those who are perpetrating these behaviors against them. So the measurement of perpetration is of increasing interest to me, although we have had less success actually measuring perpetration in some previous research. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of sexual violence and misconduct. This is a large battery of measurements that we used. The SEQ for sexual harassment, you can see the subscales, the areas of behavior listed there. Sexist gender harassment, crude gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion. At the bottom, we have unwanted sexual contact, where we have unwanted sexual touching, attempted rape, and rape as different components of behavior that are measured by these scales. The SES is the one that measures each of those categories of behavior with several items each, but also in the context of strategies that the perpetrator might be using to achieve success in these unwanted behaviors. I just wanted to show a quick slide of how these data might break out in a study so that you can see how the overall rates might be compared against some of the subscale rates. I'm not going to really talk about the actual data itself. I'm just wanting to point out that I talked early on about overlap between some of these behaviors, between sexual violence, between sexual misconduct, between family violence and human trafficking. There's also overlap between some of the component behaviors that are occurring, and that you have, at least according to how we arrange the data here, you have increasing specificity as you go through some of these behaviors, from broad harassment, gendered behavior, down to more refined, for example, sexual coercion harassment, which has the lowest levels of prevalence. And some of the conversation that, pardon me?
Oh, I'm wondering if you could talk, just in the interest of time, if you could talk a bit about your model, because we have about 1 minute left, but we can stay longer. I think all the panelists can stay until 11:30, so we'll probably end up closing the recorded part, but continuing for Q&As if people would like to stay on. I know I have a lot of questions.
Right, yeah. So this is ongoing work that is focused on what I was talking about before, of the interactions between laborers. These models are being built in the context of day laborers in the construction industry, although they have broad application in other sectors as well. But they jointly model the behavior of the laborer and the employer, and look at the decision-making that goes on between those two classes of ecosystem participants. What we're doing is trying to collect data very selectively to drive simulation models. We have a combination of a framework that we're working with in the new study that is multi-actor stochastic network models that looks at the coevolution of the behaviors of these ecosystem participants, that then we incorporate into agent-based simulation models. Because in our view, at least early on, we'll never get enough empirical data directly from the system to figure out how well interventions work, but we'll strategically be able to gather data that can populate these models that allow us to then predict how the system might behave, thereby allowing us to test within a virtual simulation environment different interventions or control strategies that might remediate some of the illicit behaviors within the supply chain, in this case, construction labor. I think that was a minute.
Yeah, that's great. And this is super thought-provoking, and I wish that we had more time just to go through your slides, because they're quite a bit different than others. But I recognize that we're at about 11:15, but we're able to stay a little bit longer so that we have some time for Q&A. I saw a really interesting question from David Bishop in the chat box, and I know that I have a few questions for the panelists, but if you have questions, please enter them into the chat box now. And I don't know, Matt, did you have any closing thoughts? I didn't want to cut you off prematurely.
No, I just thought this would be, this is my attempt at putting some questions up at the end, since I knew I was going last. I thought I might prompt us a little bit, but certainly any questions from our audience is great. Any questions from the other panelists is great. This is my attempt at getting that process started. So.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. Well, like I said, I have a lot of questions, but I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask questions. And I saw this really interesting question from David Bishop asking about whether or not we could approach trafficking and other types of labor exploitation in a similar way to what some areas of the law have done in terms of differences between like first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, et cetera. And so I was wondering what, especially Mikhail or Sheldon, what you thought about having a tiered framework. I'll repost his question in the chat too.
Definitely, this is Sheldon. I think this is a great idea. I think this also, I guess, comes to my familiar territory, which is the criminal justice framework. Yeah, if there are clear indicators, like Mikhail's work back in 2009, that there, the strong, medium, and weak indicator there. With enough strong indicators, we certainly can rank some violations of victimization much more severe than others. So like first-degree murder, second-degree, then involuntary manslaughter, and so on and so forth. So have a graded measure. Yes, definitely. It's a great idea. Again, it will take a collective effort to come to that agreement. I agree. Thank you.
And Mikhail, did you have anything to add to that, and maybe how that could be applied within the context of the sector and supply chain approach that you are developing, that the ILO is developing?
I would be more reluctant to this idea of tier, although I really see the interest from a measurement point of view. But our legal framework at the ILO doesn't leave space to grading. You know, it's not that there is acceptable forms of forced labor and non-acceptable. Having said so, those of you who have gray hair may remember the discussion when the Convention on the Worst Form of Child Labor came, because that was the issue. We had a good convention on child labor, but we knew we had to accelerate action and to focus on things that need to be eliminated as a matter of priority. So the notion of worst form of child labor came, although all child labor should be abolished, but there was a focus. So maybe we could imagine something like that. But there is no grading in forced labor. There is a continuum between decent work and forced labor. You know, there are many forms of what people would call exploitation, which is not a term defined, but forms of labor which are not decent and which are not forced labor. There is a spectrum. But when we talk about forced labor, really there is this notion of lack of consent, really threat, penalty, which is binary, I would say.
Yeah,
I mean, this
thank you,
oh, go ahead, Davina. I had a question for you, actually. I don't know. This talk about underlying theory made me think about your presentation and how you mentioned theory a lot in it. And I was wondering if you could talk, obviously, please respond to Mikhail and Sheldon, but if you could talk more about how theory informs your modeling work, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I appreciate it. And yeah, on Mikhail and Sheldon's point in particular, I think they're exactly right to identify the challenges there. And actually, I was going to say in our slavery at sea work, we actually are confronting something similar, where there's what we can constitute from like an ILO convention perspective, which is like decent work. Then there's, you know, the forced labor component, but then there's also something that's even better than like decent work, which would be like ideal working environments where like there's like free labor organizing and things that we actually think would be really useful to advocate for from a policy perspective. So I think there's, to Mikhail's point from a measurement perspective, I totally agree. And I think that is a challenge. And then I wonder if maybe we set kind of, if not like a binary, but maybe like a 3-tiered kind of, if we use the word tier, but like something where there's, you know, here's acceptable work, here's unacceptable work. And I think that distinction is really important because it's already so difficult to demonstrate forced labor within that context that I think making like sharper distinctions between like this level of exploitation is tolerable is a bit problematic. But then we can go from like decent and not decent work to then also like ideal working standards on the other side, which might be something that could even enhance our policy efforts. So that could be, that's something we're talking about in a lot of the slavery at sea component, just to try to add some clarity around that. Specifically in that context too, the industry is not very clear on a lot of how this intersects with environmental sustainability, oversight mechanisms, and human rights mechanisms. So it's just an interesting ongoing topic. To respond to your point on theory, and I think this is something that's actually a little bit related, right? It has to do with how we think about these constructs and how we align them, and especially with the literature. I think all of us struggle, and Sheldon and Matt, especially looking at the broader literatures from criminology and systems thinking and engineering, I think they can see that like in the modern slavery and the human trafficking space, we have quite a bit less of the published literature that we can kind of build on and test. And I think it's a lot of adaptive thinking from like other fields that's really enhanced that effort. The reason why I think the theory is so important is because what I've seen in terms of trying to understand other existing vulnerability methods and trying to assimilate some of those best practices into what we are doing is that without a theoretical framework, effectively, a lot of us are starting over from scratch every time we develop a new model. It becomes very construct dependent. It becomes driven by the vulnerability variables that they themselves change from year to year. So I think it's much more consistent if you're looking at a long-term and eventually comparable system to think about the theory as the guiding framework rather than to allow just the empirical evidence to guide how those vulnerability models are constructed. And I think it can be as loose or as strong as you anticipate needing. I think, the human security framework is generally very loosely applied in terms of just broad vulnerability identification, right? But I think there's still value in having some thought behind that theory so that when other people look to use your model, they understand the assumptions and some of the definitional approaches that you're taking from the outset.
Yeah, I think, again, going back to the question from David, to me, just really highlighted again the value of using interdisciplinary approaches to our work. And Matt, that leads me back to a question for you that I wondered if you could talk about a little bit more, which is how these collaborations between computer scientists, operations engineers, and social scientists have worked out in practice in your research. And if you have any tips or thoughts for others who are looking to start this type of collaboration to look at building network models to interdict trafficking and other types of illicit networks.
Well, yeah, I've got a couple of quick thoughts, and then it can run a lot deeper too. The first thing is that it takes time to develop the right kind of language to translate between the disciplines. And I was somewhat surprised at that because I'm naive. But at the same time, even when you have several years of work with folks across disciplines, you still have a mindset towards different approaches to problems. And so engineers like to fix things. And especially when you start thinking about network approaches, what they want to do is break the links in the network, reduce the edges. And it's more like an intervention that is maybe focused on law enforcement or arrests or other types of things that breaks down the structure of an illicit supply chain, when in fact, most of the solution has to consider, at least as part of it, education and other sorts of social interventions that have to do with how people deal with these other layers that we're talking about relative to what I was describing as subscales. So if we talk about labor trafficking as meets most of the legal standards, that's a small component of wage theft. So there are interventions that can address wage theft circumstances that are vastly outnumber the circumstances of labor trafficking, where that wage theft might occur under the context of forced fraud or coercion. But there are different interventional targets, some of which are law enforcement interdiction related, others of which have to do with education and public health campaigns.
That's helpful. We had a question in the chat box that I don't know, Sheldon or Mikhail, it seems like you might be well positioned to respond about how to make audits better, including in the context of the global pandemic.
Audit. That's not really my field of competence, audit. What I can say that we've been asked to translate our measurement framework for detection indicators, which is maybe closer to audit. So how could first-line respondents use the work we've done to recognize elements of involuntary work, elements of coercion, to detect people, not for statistical point of view, but for let's say, detection in any kind of situation where you have someone in contact with potential victims. Sheldon, anything to?
It's good questions. But compliance audit, it's tough to. I've given some thought about supply chain issues. Compliance audit, I guess the main thing is whatever you want to do, the measurement I guess relying on peers and pre-test and focus groups and cognitive tests are important as a way to validate your measures. I think for compliance audits, you're essentially talking about taking some sort of a tape measure, conceptually. It's a constructability issue. You tape measure, take it and make sure that tape measure contains the elements that will pertain directly, content-wise, or even at the face validity to what you were looking for. And I think construct validity is something that I've been struggling a lot as to, in terms of operationalization. So I think we are facing similar struggles, whether it's going out to measure modern slavery or in your case, looking for appropriate measures that can help you with the compliance audit. So it's the same set of and we are struggling, like Mikhail mentioned, that in the field research, you quickly realize the binary perspective doesn't really work. If that's why you have a spectrum, that's why we talk about continuum. In terms of legal framework, this oftentimes comes as a sort of as a binary perspective, just either or situation, but in reality is not. Which is why Mikhail mentioned that the worst form of child labor, which was one we used in my India study, that if you were to open up to look at child labor, it's everywhere. I mean, the degrees of exploitation is all over the places. So we can only focus on the worst forms of child labor in order to make the prevalence rate somewhat reasonable. Otherwise, you'll be reaching 90–95% of the problem. So that makes your research finding somewhat meaningless. So we're I mean, it's a common problem for all the field researchers, just to get out of the binary.
Something, on the compliance audits, something I could have mentioned is that there is a hope that if our surveys along the supply chain work, that will help people to focus their attention for audit at some tiers or some branch of economic activity where the survey will have shown that the risk is higher. So there is definitely some collaboration and some, to be set up, but we are not here yet.
So one thing that I just wanted, I'm conscious of the time, one thing that I wanted to close with is one parting question that Matt and I have talked about before, but that we haven't discussed in this panel, which is around the trade-offs between effort spent identifying vulnerable community members and exploiting them versus the effort of collecting additional data from them about their various interactions and their responses to interventions. And I was wondering, Matt, if you have thoughts that you wanted to share with us around some of the trade-offs with conducting research, and also maybe thinking about the ethics of using respondents' time as well, and anyone else who wants to share their thoughts as well. I think that would be great.
I'll go first, but I'm sure everyone's going to have something to add here. I mean, obviously, one of the challenges that we face as researchers is this various data collection effort that we broadly need. And of course, that places a burden on the community members who are collecting those data from. In some cases, that actually, as Mikhail was talking about, it puts them at risk to provide those data. So we have lots of human subject protections that we can implement, but at the end of the day, we're trying to measure a system, an ecosystem with interactions that occur over long periods of time that really is very different than being in a manufacturing facility where you can collect data on the nanosecond 24 hours a day. We need to navigate the tension between going out and studying communities, monitoring communities, and the fact that they have agency in their lives and are actually making choices, sometimes putting themselves in what we would consider to be exploited situations, but they're doing so compared to other alternatives that they have. And so we might talk about them as victims or survivors, and yet they're talking about themselves as just getting through the day. And so there's this huge tension about how much data we have the right to collect from them. Yes, we're trying to solve problems, and all of us are talking about needing more data, but what does that actually say about the communities from whom we're trying to get those data?
Mhm.
And I'm
Yeah.
probably the worst perpetrator because I want network models, which now means data continuously from all participants in ecosystem, not just surveys among some individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone else have closing thoughts they wanted to share? And Mikhail, to go, so it's okay if you need to drop off.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to everyone for participating in this panel. Thank you so much to the participants. Thank you to USAID and Winrock and their colleagues at Insight for helping us to coordinate this. Thank you everyone for staying a little bit over time. I think that the discussion is super interesting. The session has been recorded and I know that we will be able to share this. I think that we can share slides as well for most of the panelists. So I will follow up on that, but thank you again, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. It just is, this is such a fantastic open area of research.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Lauren, for organizing
Thank you.
and bringing us all together. Excellent job,
Thank you,
Lauren.
Lauren.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the Evidence to Action Summit in today's session. Please do join us at other sessions at the summit. The next session will be tomorrow morning, Bangkok time. We've got 2 sessions starting at 9 and 10 a.m. titled Identifying and Addressing Forced Labor in Supply Chains, followed by Leveraging Technology in Private Sector Initiatives, Innovative Solutions, Practices, and Research Methodologies. Please continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams, especially if you are interested in finding collaborators for the pitch competition being offered through participation in the Evidence to Action Summit. Thank you again for your participation and have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.